There is a story that begins with a man who had everything. He had a wife. He had a newborn son. He had 3 palaces, one for each season of the year, and servants to fill them with music and food and every pleasure his culture could produce. He was the heir to a small kingdom in the foothills of the Himalayas, 25 centuries ago. By every measure the world recognizes, his life was already complete before it had really begun. And one night, at the age of 29, he walked out of it. He took nothing with him but a robe and a begging bowl. He did not leave because he was unhappy. He left because he had seen 3 things on a road outside his palace, on 3 afternoons one after the other, that made the comfort of his life intolerable. He had seen what every person eventually sees. He had simply absorbed it more completely than most. What he went looking for in the forest, and what he claimed to have found 6 years later sitting under a fig tree in what is now northern India, is the subject of everything that follows. He would become known as the Buddha, which is not a name but a title. It means the awakened one. And the teaching he would spend the rest of his life giving begins with a single devastating observation. Life is suffering, not because something went wrong, not because you made a mistake, or because the world is unusually cruel, or because you have been singled out for misfortune. Life is suffering because this is what life is. This is the claim. It is 25 centuries old, and nothing that has happened in those 25 centuries has refuted it. Consider the shape of an ordinary day. You wake, and before your feet touch the floor, the mind is already reaching, already wanting something to be different. The room is too cold or too warm. The sleep was not enough or was too much. There is something you need to do that you do not want to do, and the anticipation of it sits in the chest like a low, steady weight. You have not yet spoken a word, and already the day has failed to satisfy. This is not depression. This is not a clinical condition. This is the ordinary texture of being conscious, the faint but persistent sense that things are not quite right. The usual word for it is suffering, and that word is not wrong, but it is incomplete. What we are pointing to is not only the sharp pain of grief or injury, it is something broader and more difficult to pin down. Unsatisfactoriness, a fundamental dis-ease at the heart of experience. The ancient image was of an axle that does not sit properly in its wheel, a wheel that turns but never turns smoothly. That image is worth holding. Life turns, it moves, things happen. But there is a wobble at the centre, a friction that never fully resolves, and that friction is the suffering we mean here. There are obvious forms of suffering: illness, loss, the death of someone you love, the slow deterioration of the body as the years pass. No philosophy is needed to recognize these. They are plain, and they are terrible, and they have been the subject of human lamentation since the first person watched the first person die. But the claim being made here is not about obvious suffering. The claim is about something more subtle and, in its way, more devastating. The claim is that even when things are going well, when you are healthy and loved and successful by every measure that the world recognizes, there is still something that does not settle. There is still the wobble. You get the thing you wanted, the job, the house, the relationship, the achievement, and for a moment there is satisfaction, perhaps even joy. But the satisfaction does not last. It cannot last, because it was never the thing itself that you wanted. What you wanted was the end of wanting, and the end of wanting does not come, because the mind immediately generates a new desire, a new gap between what is and what could be. The promotion leads to the desire for the next promotion. The new house leads to the desire for a different house. The relationship that once felt like the answer to everything slowly becomes the source of new questions, new dissatisfactions, new forms of the same old reaching, This is not cynicism. This is observation. Watch the mind for a single hour and you will see it happen. The wanting does not stop. It changes shape, it finds new objects, but its fundamental character remains the same. It is a thirst that drinking does not quench. This pattern, the endless cycle of desire, temporary satisfaction, and renewed desire, is not a flaw in you. It is not evidence that you are doing life wrong. It is the structure of desire itself. Wanting is, by its nature, an experience of absence. To want something is to experience the fact that you do not have it, and that experience of not having is a form of suffering, however mild. When you get what you want, the absence is briefly filled, but the capacity for wanting remains, and it will find something else to want. The machine does not turn off, it only changes targets. Think of the person who has achieved everything they set out to achieve. The career is established, the family is healthy, the house is paid for, the retirement is funded. By every rational accounting, the work is done. And yet the person is not at peace. There is still something, a restlessness, a nagging feeling that something has been left undone, a low hum of dissatisfaction that no accomplishment can silence. They may not even be able to name it. It is not a specific desire. It is the condition of being a desiring creature in a world that offers no final satisfaction. The Buddhist tradition identifies this as the most pervasive form of suffering, the form that has nothing to do with external circumstances and everything to do with the structure of consciousness itself. We might recognize this in the small pleasures. A meal you anticipate for days is eaten in 20 minutes and gone. A holiday planned for months passes in what feels like an afternoon. The song you could not stop listening to loses its power after the 30th repetition. Something in the repetition, in the familiarity, drains the pleasure away. And there is a particular kind of sadness in this, a sadness that is difficult to articulate because it is not attached to any single loss. It is the sadness of realizing that pleasure itself is unreliable, that the very thing you are enjoying is already in the process of becoming something you once enjoyed. The deeper forms of suffering are harder to see because they are woven into the fabric of experience so thoroughly that we take them for granted. There is the suffering of change, the awareness, sometimes conscious and sometimes not, that everything you value is temporary. Your health will fail. Your relationships will end through distance or disagreement or death. The version of yourself that exists today, with these specific memories, these specific habits, this specific way of seeing the world, is a temporary arrangement that is already in the process of dissolving. You are not the person you were 10 years ago. You will not be the person you are now 10 years from now. And the person who exists in the gap between these versions, the person you call yourself, is not a fixed thing but a process, a river that is never the same water twice. To love your life is to love something that is disappearing. To hold anything is to hold something that is already leaving your hands. And then there is the most fundamental form of suffering, the suffering that arises simply from being a conditioned, contingent, impermanent being in a conditioned, contingent, impermanent world. This is not a suffering you can fix by getting the right job or finding the right partner or arranging the external circumstances of your life in the correct order. This is a suffering that is built into the nature of consciousness itself. To be aware is to be aware of change. To be aware of change is to be aware of loss. And to be aware of loss is to suffer, however quietly, however much the mind tries to distract itself from the fact. Most people, most of the time, manage not to notice. The distractions are effective. Work fills the hours. Entertainment fills the evenings. Plans for the future fill the mind with a sense of forward motion that keeps the deeper questions at bay. And there is nothing wrong with this. It is how human beings have lived for as long as there have been human beings. But every so often the distractions fail. A death, a diagnosis, a moment of stillness that lasts a beat too long, and in that gap the question surfaces, is this all there is? Not in the dramatic existential crisis sense, in the quieter, more unsettling sense. The sense that even when everything is fine, something is not fine. That even when you have everything you are supposed to want, the wanting does not stop. This is what suffering means. Not the screaming agony of catastrophe, but the quiet, persistent hum of a life that never quite arrives at the contentment it is reaching for. It is there in the morning when you check the time and realize the night went too fast. It is there in the evening when you look back on a day that should have been good enough, but somehow was not. It is there in the gap between what you expected and what you got, between the life you imagined and the life you are living. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply hums, low and constant, beneath everything else. This is what the Buddha heard. This hum, this friction, this quiet, persistent dissatisfaction that does not announce itself and does not go away. He heard it more clearly than anyone before or since, and he spent the rest of his life trying to understand it. He claimed to have found its cause. He claimed to have found its cure. The awakening under the fig tree was not a mystical experience in the sense that the word is often used. Not a vision of God. Not a moment of cosmic union. Not an ecstatic dissolution of the self into the infinite. It was, if the earliest texts are to be believed, something more modest and more radical than any of these. It was the clear, direct perception of how suffering works, why it arises, what sustains it, and how it can be brought to an end. The tradition that grew from his teaching would become one of the largest and most diverse in human history. It would spread across India, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, China, Korea, Japan, and Tibet. It would generate an immense body of literature, thousands of monasteries, dozens of distinct schools of thought, and a philosophical tradition sophisticated enough to stand alongside anything produced by the Greek, the Islamic, or the modern Western world. But all of it, every text, every practice, every philosophical argument across 25 centuries, traces back to a single diagnosis. Life is suffering, you are suffering, and you do not have to be. That is the claim. It is not a prayer, not a creed, not an article of faith. It is a proposition about the nature of experience, offered by a man who said he had tested it against his own consciousness and found it to be true. He did not ask anyone to believe him. He asked them to test it themselves. Look at your own experience, he said, in effect. Watch the mind. Watch the wanting. Watch the way satisfaction dissolves and desire reconstitutes itself in a new form. See if what I am saying matches what you find. The earliest texts present the Buddha not as a savior, but as a physician. He diagnosed a disease. He identified its cause. He declared that it could be cured. And he prescribed a course of treatment. The disease is suffering. The cause is something the tradition calls craving or thirst, the relentless drive of the mind toward what it does not have and away from what it does not want. The cure is the cessation of that craving, and the treatment is a specific set of practices, a path with 8 components that the Buddha claimed would lead, if followed with sufficient commitment, to the end of suffering. This is the framework that everything else rests on. Every teaching, every sermon, every philosophical elaboration in the vast body of Buddhist literature is, in one way or another, an exploration of these 4 claims. They are known as the 4 Noble Truths, and they are the backbone of the entire system. They are elegant in their simplicity and devastating in their implications. If the first truth is correct, If life really is characterized by a fundamental unsatisfactoriness that no amount of external success can resolve, then most of what we spend our lives pursuing is, at best, a temporary distraction from a problem that runs deeper than any particular circumstance. We will return to these truths in detail. We will return to the path. We will return to the philosophical arguments that the Buddha marshaled in their defense, arguments about the nature of the self, the reality of change, and the structure of causation that remain as provocative today as they were when they were first articulated in a deer park outside an ancient city in northern India. But first, before the philosophy, before the arguments, before the path, there is the life. There is the man who sat under a tree and claimed to have seen something that the rest of us have not yet seen. And that life, however much it has been embellished by centuries of devotion, begins in a very specific place. A small kingdom at the foot of the Himalayas, in a world that was already old. The man who would become the Buddha was born into comfort, not the modest comfort of a prosperous merchant or a successful farmer, but the insulated, carefully maintained comfort of a ruling family in a small but independent territory in the Gangetic plain of northern India. His father was the chief or king of the ruling clan, whose seat of power was a city near what is now the border between Nepal and India. His mother died 7 days after giving birth. The dates of his life are uncertain, and this uncertainty matters more than it might seem. The traditional dating, long accepted in traditional Buddhist countries, places his birth around 563 BCE and his death around 483 BCE. But modern scholarship has increasingly favoured a later chronology, placing his birth closer to 480 BCE and his death around 400 BCE. The revised dating is based on cross-referencing events in the early Buddhist texts with dates that can be established from Greek and Indian historical sources, particularly the reign of a later Indian emperor. The difference is not trivial. It changes his relationship to other intellectual movements in India, including the development of parallel ascetic traditions and the late sacrificial tradition of the priests. For our purposes, it is enough to say that he lived and taught in northeast India sometime in the 5th century BCE, give or take a generation. The world he was born into was one of remarkable intellectual ferment. The Gangetic plain in this period was home to dozens of small kingdoms and tribal republics, each with its own political structure and cultural traditions. Trade was expanding, cities were growing. The old sacrificial religion, centered on elaborate rituals performed by priests, was being challenged by a diverse group of wandering teachers and ascetics known collectively as the Strivers. These wanderers had renounced conventional life to seek answers to questions that the established religion did not adequately address. What happens after death? What is the nature of the self? Is there a way to escape the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth that the Indian tradition took as a basic feature of existence? The movement of the Strivers was not a single school of thought. It was a broad and contentious ecosystem of competing ideas, and the future Buddha was one of many young men who left home to enter it. The intellectual culture of this period is sometimes compared to the golden age of Athenian philosophy, and the comparison has some merit. In both cases, a period of political instability and rapid social change produced an explosion of philosophical inquiry. The questions were different. The Greeks asked about justice, truth, and the good life in the city-state. The Indians asked about the self, the nature of consciousness, and the possibility of escape from the cycle of suffering. But the seriousness was the same. These were people for whom getting the answers right was not an academic exercise. It was a matter of life and death, or more precisely, of life and death and rebirth, because the Indian philosophical world operated on the assumption that death was not an ending, but a transition, and that the quality of the next life depended on how this one was lived. But first, there was the palace. The early texts describe his upbringing in terms that are clearly idealized, perhaps mythologized, but that communicate a psychological truth that transcends the question of historical accuracy. His father, learning from astrologers or wise men that the child might one day renounce the world and become a great spiritual teacher, resolved to prevent this by surrounding him with every conceivable pleasure and shielding him from every form of suffering. The young prince had 3 palaces, one for each season. He wore the finest garments. He ate the finest food. He was attended by musicians, dancers, and servants. He was given everything a person could want, and the one thing he was not given was the truth. He grew up, married, and fathered a son, and the name they gave the child meant fetter or chain, a detail the tradition does not let pass without comment. He was, by every external measure, a man who had everything: wealth, family, health, youth, status. And yet something was missing. The texts do not describe this as a vague spiritual restlessness. They describe it as a specific encounter with facts that his father had spent a lifetime trying to hide. The story of the 4 sights is one of the most famous in all of religious and philosophical literature. Whether it records actual events or distills a longer process of awakening into a symbolic narrative is a question that the earliest texts do not answer, and perhaps it does not matter. The story works because it describes something that every person eventually experiences, the moment when the protected mind confronts the unprotected truth. On the first journey outside the palace grounds, he saw an old man, bent, wrinkled, leaning on a stick, moving slowly down the road. He had never seen old age. He turned to his charioteer and asked what was wrong with the man. The charioteer told him the truth. This is what happens to everyone. This is what will happen to you. On the second journey, he saw a sick man, wasted by disease, lying by the side of the road. Again the question. Again the answer. This happens to everyone. On the third journey, he saw a corpse being carried to the cremation ground, and the charioteer told him what death was. And on the fourth journey, he saw an ascetic, a man who had renounced everything, who walked calmly through the world with nothing but a robe and a begging bowl, and whose face showed a peace that he had never seen in anyone. The 4 sights are old age, sickness, death, and the possibility of a response to them. The first 3 are the problem. The fourth is the suggestion that the problem might have a solution, and the story insists on a particular order. He does not encounter the ascetic first. He encounters the suffering first. He sees what life actually is before he sees what might be done about it. The philosophy follows the experience. The answer follows the question. This structural pattern would recur throughout the Buddha's teaching career. He always began with the problem. He always made the listener feel the weight of the problem before offering the response. The diagnosis precedes the treatment, and the treatment has no force until the patient understands the disease. What is striking about this narrative, even in its most embellished form, is the specificity of the shock. He is not troubled by abstract philosophical puzzles. He is not wondering about the nature of reality in the way that a Greek philosopher might. He is confronted by 3 concrete facts: bodies age, bodies get sick, bodies die. These are not insights. They are the most obvious features of human existence, so obvious that most people manage to live their entire lives without truly absorbing them. He absorbed them. He absorbed them completely, and the absorption was so total that his entire previous life, the palaces, the pleasures, the family, the future that had been prepared for him, became intolerable. Not because it was bad, but because it was built on a lie. The lie that these things could last. The lie that comfort could be permanent. The lie that if you arranged the external conditions of your life carefully enough, you could avoid the fundamental facts of the human condition. The earliest Buddhist canon presents what happened next with remarkable directness. In the text known as the Discourse on the Noble Search, the Buddha describes his renunciation in his own voice, or in the voice the tradition attributes to him. He says that he was a young man, black-haired, blessed with youth, in the first stage of life, and that despite the wishes of his weeping parents, he shaved off his hair and beard, put on the yellow robe, and went forth from home into homelessness. He does not describe this as an act of rejection. He describes it as a search. He was searching for what does not age, what does not sicken, what does not die. He was searching for the unborn, the unaging, the deathless. The decision to leave was, by any standard, an act of extraordinary moral complexity. He left his wife. He left his newborn son, the child whose very name means fetter. He left his aging father, the man who had spent decades trying to protect him from the truth. Later, Buddhist tradition would handle this difficulty in various ways, sometimes by softening the departure, sometimes by suggesting that his wife and son were already provided for, sometimes by arguing that the magnitude of what he would discover justified the pain he caused in seeking it. But the earliest texts do not flinch from the cost. The renunciation was real, the grief of those left behind was real, and the tradition does not pretend otherwise. This is important because it establishes something about the character of the philosophy that would follow. The Buddha's teaching did not emerge from a life of ease. It emerged from a life that had been easy and was deliberately made hard, not out of masochism, but out of a conviction that the easy life was built on ignorance. He did not leave the palace because he was unhappy in the ordinary sense. He left because the happiness the palace offered was conditional on not knowing certain things, and he had come to know them. Once you have seen the old man, the sick man, and the dead man, the palace looks different. The pleasures do not change, but your relationship to them changes, because you now know that the person enjoying them is subject to the same forces that bent the old man and wasted the sick man and killed the dead man. The pleasures are real, but they are temporary, and the person enjoying them is temporary, and the awareness of this temporariness is a kind of suffering that no amount of pleasure can address. He was 29 years old according to the traditional chronology when he left. He took nothing with him but the robe he wore and the bowl he carried. He entered the world of the wandering ascetics and seekers who populated the forests and crossroads of the Gangetic Plain, each pursuing their own path to liberation from the cycle of birth and death that the Indian tradition called the endless wandering, the wheel of becoming that turns and never arrives anywhere. The world of the wandering ascetics was not a gentle world. These were men, and occasionally women, who had abandoned everything, family, property, social identity, to pursue a question that consumed them. Some practiced extreme austerities, starving themselves, sleeping on beds of thorns, standing for hours in the burning sun or the freezing rain. Some practiced elaborate meditation techniques designed to still the mind and reveal the hidden nature of reality. Some engaged in rigorous philosophical debate, constructing and demolishing arguments with a precision that would have impressed the Greeks. Some rejected all conventional morality and lived as radical antinomians, claiming that for the liberated soul, no action could be sinful. It was a world of extraordinary intellectual and spiritual diversity, and he entered it with the same totality of commitment that had characterized everything he had done. He sought out teachers. He studied. He practiced. He pushed himself to the limits of what the human body and mind could endure, and for 6 years he found that nothing he tried was sufficient. The problem he had identified, the problem of suffering, remained unsolved. The teachers he found were skilled, their methods were genuine, but something was missing. The old man was still old. The sick man was still sick. The dead man was still dead. And the ascetic wandering the road, for all the peace on his face, had not yet answered the question that had driven him from his father's house. Is there a way to end this? Not to escape it, not to hide from it, not to numb yourself to it, but to actually end it. The 6 years of seeking would take him to 2 renowned meditation masters through the most extreme forms of self-denial the Indian tradition had to offer, and finally to a night under a tree near the banks of a river where, the tradition claims, everything changed. But before we follow him there, it is worth pausing to consider what the story of the prince who left actually means, stripped of its mythological embellishments and read as a philosophical document. It means this: the good life, as the world defines it, is not enough. Not because there is something wrong with pleasure, or comfort, or love, or family. These things are real and they are valuable. But they do not solve the problem. The problem is not that you lack something. The problem is that everything you have and everything you are is impermanent. And no arrangement of impermanent things can produce permanent satisfaction. This is not pessimism. It is arithmetic. If everything you hold will eventually be taken from you, then holding is itself a form of suffering. Not because holding is bad, but because the thing you are holding is already leaving. He saw this. He saw it clearly enough to walk away from a life that most people would envy. And he walked into the forest to find out whether there was anything that did not leave. His first teacher was a respected meditation master who taught a technique for achieving a state of consciousness he called the base of nothingness, a condition in which the mind withdraws from all sensory experience and rests in a formless, contentless awareness. He learned the technique quickly. He mastered it completely. The teacher was so impressed that he offered to make him his co-teacher, to share leadership of the community. He declined. The state of nothingness was real, he acknowledged, and the meditation that produced it was genuine. But it did not solve the problem. When you emerged from the meditation, the world was still there. The aging was still there. The sickness, the death, the suffering. The meditation was a temporary escape, not a permanent cure, and he was looking for a cure. His second teacher taught an even more refined meditative state called the base of neither perception nor non-perception, a condition so subtle that the mind could not be said to be either conscious or unconscious. Once again, he mastered the practice. Once again, the teacher offered him co-leadership. Once again, he left. The same objection applied. The state was real, but it was temporary. It was an island of calm in a sea of suffering, and stepping off the island put you right back in the sea. He was not looking for an island. He was looking for a way to drain the sea. The early Buddhist texts describe these two encounters with a notable lack of hostility. The Buddha, looking back on his early training, does not dismiss his teachers. He acknowledges their skill. He acknowledges the reality of the states they taught him to achieve. His criticism is precise and limited. These states, however profound, do not lead to the end of suffering. They lead to temporary relief, which is not the same thing. The distinction matters because it reveals something about the standard by which the Buddha would judge every practice and every teaching for the rest of his life. The question was never whether a practice felt good or produced interesting experiences or was technically difficult to achieve. The question was always whether it worked, whether it actually permanently ended suffering, and by this standard, the highest meditative achievements of his culture fell short. Having exhausted what the meditation teachers could offer, he turned to the other great tradition of the wanderers, extreme asceticism. The logic of asceticism is straightforward. If desire is the cause of suffering, then the way to end suffering is to destroy desire. And the way to destroy desire is to deny the body everything it wants until the body's hold on the mind is broken. He threw himself into this practice with the same intensity he had brought to meditation. He fasted until his spine could be felt through his belly. He held his breath until his head roared with pain. He ate so little that the tradition says he survived on a single grain of rice per day, though this is almost certainly an exaggeration intended to convey the severity of his discipline rather than a factual report. 5 companions joined him in this practice, 5 fellow ascetics who were impressed by his commitment and who believed that if anyone could achieve liberation through self-mortification, it was this former prince who seemed willing to die in the attempt. The early sculptures that depict the fasting figure show a body reduced to a skeleton draped in skin, ribs protruding, limbs wasted, eyes sunken. The image is not beautiful. It is not meant to be. It is meant to show what happens when the will turns against the flesh with full force. And it did not work. After perhaps 5 or 6 years of this practice, he was forced to a conclusion that was, in its way, as radical as anything he would later teach. Self-mortification is a dead end, not because it is too difficult, but because it is based on a false assumption. The assumption is that the body is the enemy, that desire lives in the flesh and can be starved out of it, that the path to freedom runs through the destruction of physical experience. He discovered that this is wrong. The mind starved of food does not become clearer. It becomes weaker. The body pushed to collapse does not release the spirit. It drags the spirit down with it. You cannot think your way to liberation if your brain is shutting down from malnutrition. You cannot see clearly if you are delirious from pain. This realization produced what the tradition calls the middle way, neither indulgence nor deprivation, neither the luxury of the palace nor the starvation of the forest. The body needs enough food, enough rest, enough health to allow the mind to do its work. The path is not through the destruction of physical life, but through the correct understanding of it. One can imagine how this sounded to his 5 companions. They had starved alongside him for years, and now he was saying that the starving was pointless. They left him in disgust. They believed he had given up, that he had lost his nerve, that the former prince was returning to the soft life he had abandoned. They were wrong. What he had given up was not the search, but the wrong method of searching. And what happened next is the most famous event in the Buddhist tradition, and one of the most remarkable claims in the history of human thought. He accepted a bowl of milk rice from a young woman. He ate it. He bathed in the river. He walked to a fig tree in what is now northeastern India. He sat down on a cushion of grass beneath the tree, crossed his legs, and resolved not to rise until he had found what he was looking for. The tree would later be known as the Tree of Awakening. The night that followed would become the pivotal moment of the entire tradition. The early Buddhist texts describe the night in stages. First, the temptation by a tempter figure. This tempter represents the forces that keep beings trapped in the cycle of birth and death. He is not a devil in the Christian sense, not a metaphysical principle of evil, but something closer to the personification of everything in the mind that resists liberation. The tempter sent armies against him, demons with terrible weapons, storms of fire and darkness. He did not move. The tempter sent beautiful daughters, beautiful beyond description, to seduce him with pleasure. He did not move. The tempter challenged his right to sit where he sat, to claim the seat of awakening. He reached down and touched the earth with his right hand, calling the earth itself as witness. This gesture, the earth-touching pose, became one of the most iconic images in Buddhist art, repeated in statues and paintings across the entire Buddhist world for 25 centuries. Whether this tempter was a being, a psychological state, or a narrative device is a question the texts do not resolve, and the tradition has never agreed on an answer. What matters is what the story communicates. The last obstacle to liberation is not external. It is the mind's own resistance to seeing clearly. The fears, the desires, the attachments, the deeply ingrained habits of thought that make suffering feel inevitable. He sat through all of it. He did not fight, he did not flee, he watched. Then came the 3 watches of the night. In the first watch, the tradition says, he saw his own previous lives, an unbroken chain of births and deaths stretching back through incalculable time. He saw himself as a king, a beggar, an animal, a god. He saw the wheel of rebirth turning and never stopping. Whether we read this as a literal memory of past lives or as a metaphor for the recognition that consciousness has been trapped in repetitive patterns since before individual memory begins, the philosophical point is the same. The problem of suffering is not new. It is not a product of this particular life or this particular set of circumstances. It is the condition of existence itself, and it has been the condition of existence for as long as existence has been. In the second watch, he saw the deaths and rebirths of all beings, the entire panorama of conscious life arising, passing away, and arising again, driven by the force of their actions, their attachments, their ignorance. He saw the mechanism. He saw why beings are born where they are born, why they suffer what they suffer, why the wheel keeps turning. The mechanism was not fate, and it was not chance. It was causation. Specific conditions produce specific results. Ignorance produces craving. Craving produces clinging. Clinging produces becoming. Becoming produces birth. Birth produces aging and death. And aging and death produce the grief, the lamentation, the despair that drives the whole cycle forward into the next round. In the third watch, as dawn approached, he saw the way out. He saw that the causal chain that produces suffering can be broken, not by force, not by willpower, not by divine intervention, but by understanding. By seeing clearly how the chain works, the mind can stop feeding it. Craving arises from ignorance. Remove the ignorance, and the craving loses its foundation. Remove the craving, and the clinging dissolves. Remove the clinging, and the entire structure of suffering collapses, not gradually but completely, the way a building collapses when you remove the load-bearing wall. The early texts say that at the moment of this realization, he spoke these words: "Through many a birth in the endless cycle have I wandered, seeking the builder of this house. Painful is repeated birth. O house builder, you are seen. You will build no house again. All your rafters are broken. Your ridgepole is destroyed. My mind has attained the unconditioned. Achieved is the end of craving." Whatever happened under that tree, the tradition is making a specific philosophical claim. The claim is not that he had a mystical experience of cosmic oneness, or that he was visited by a god, or that he transcended the physical world and entered a spiritual realm. The claim is that he understood something. He saw the structure of suffering with total clarity, the way a physician sees the structure of a disease. And in seeing it, he was freed from it. The awakening was an act of cognition, not of faith. It was seeing, not believing. And what he saw was not a supernatural truth revealed from beyond the world. It was the way the world actually works, the way consciousness actually works, the way suffering actually arises, and the way it can actually cease. The word the tradition uses for this understanding simply means awakening, and it is from this word that the title Buddha derives. The awakened one, not the saved one, not the chosen one, not the anointed one. The one who woke up. The metaphor is precise. Before awakening, you are asleep. You are dreaming. The dream feels real, and within the dream you suffer, you desire, you fear, you cling to things that are already disappearing. The awakening does not change the world. It changes your relationship to it. The tree is still a tree. The river is still a river. The body still ages, sickens, and dies. But the dreamer is awake, and the awake mind does not suffer in the same way that the dreaming mind suffers. because it sees what is happening instead of being lost in it. He sat under the tree for some time after the awakening. The texts say 7 days, though the number is formulaic. He was reluctant at first to teach what he had discovered. The early texts say that he considered remaining silent, that the truth he had seen was subtle, deep, hard to see, and that a generation delighting in attachment would find it difficult to understand. The tradition says that a god intervened, descending from the heavens to plead with the Buddha to teach, arguing that there were beings with only a little dust in their eyes who would benefit from hearing the truth. Whether this episode is historical, mythological, or simply a way of dramatizing the internal debate of a man who had discovered something enormous and was wondering whether anyone would understand it, the conclusion is the same. The Buddha decided to teach. He thought first of his 2 former teachers, but they had both recently died. So he set out for the deer park near a city to the west, where his 5 former companions, the ascetics who had abandoned him when he broke his fast, were still practicing their austerities. He walked a journey of roughly 250 kilometers, and when he arrived, the 5 ascetics saw him coming and resolved to ignore him. But something about him had changed. As he approached, they found themselves rising to their feet, offering him a seat, washing his feet. And in that deer park, under the open sky, the Buddha delivered the teaching that would become the foundation of everything that followed. The tradition calls this the discourse on setting the wheel of teaching in motion. It was the first formal presentation of the 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. It was delivered to 5 men in a deer park on the outskirts of a city that is still standing today. And its central claim is the claim with which we began. Life is suffering. Suffering has a cause. The cause can be removed, and there is a path that leads to its removal. The Buddha did not present his teaching as a revelation. He presented it as a diagnosis. This distinction is not incidental. It shapes everything about how the 4 Noble Truths are meant to be understood and how they differ from the foundational claims of most other philosophical and religious traditions. A revelation comes from outside. It is given by a god, an angel, a voice from the heavens, and its authority rests on the authority of the giver. You accept it because you trust the source. A diagnosis comes from inside the situation. It is arrived at by observing symptoms, identifying causes, and proposing a treatment. Its authority rests not on who made it, but on whether it is correct. You test it. If the treatment works, the diagnosis was right. If it does not, you revise the diagnosis and try again. The Buddha explicitly used the analogy of a physician. The early Buddhist texts compare the 4 Noble Truths to the 4 stages of medical practice as it was understood in ancient India. Identifying the disease, identifying the cause, determining whether the disease is curable, and prescribing the cure. The first Noble Truth, suffering. We have already explored this, but the Buddha's formal presentation of it at the deer park has a specificity that is worth attending to. The first discourse lists the forms of suffering with clinical precision. Birth is suffering. Aging is suffering. Sickness is suffering. Death is suffering. Association with what you dislike is suffering. Separation from what you love is suffering. Not getting what you want is suffering. In brief, the 5 aggregates of clinging are suffering. That final phrase opens onto the deeper meaning. The 5 aggregates, which we will examine later, are the components of what we ordinarily call a person: body, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. The Buddha is saying that the very structure of personal experience, the fact of being a self in a world, is characterized by suffering. This is not a statement about your circumstances. It is a statement about the nature of conditioned existence. The second Noble Truth. The origin of suffering is craving. This is the most philosophically consequential of the four truths, because it locates the cause of suffering not in the world, but in the mind's relationship to the world. The world does not make you suffer. Your craving makes you suffer. The distinction is crucial. If the world were the cause of suffering, then suffering could only end if the world changed. But the world is not going to change. People will continue to age, get sick, and die. Things will continue to be impermanent. Loss will continue to be real. If suffering depends on eliminating these things, then suffering is permanent, and the entire project is hopeless. But if the cause is craving, then the situation is different, because craving is something that happens in the mind, and the mind can be changed. Not easily, not quickly, but genuinely. This is why the second truth is the hinge of the entire system. It moves the location of the problem from out there to in here, from the world to the mind, and in doing so, it makes the problem solvable. Craving is, in its root sense, a thirst of the mind for things to be other than they are. It operates in three modes, and the Buddha identified all three with characteristic precision. There is craving for sensory pleasure, the desire for pleasant sights, sounds, tastes, smells, touches, and mental states. There is craving for existence, the desire to continue being, to persist, to endure, to not end. And there is craving for non-existence, the desire for annihilation, the wish to not be, to escape, to be done with the whole exhausting business of consciousness. These three forms of craving cover the entire spectrum of wanting: the desire for pleasure, the desire for permanence, and the desire for oblivion. Between them, they account for virtually every movement of the human mind. Consider what this means in practice. You sit in a room and you are restless. You want to be somewhere else, doing something else, being someone else. That is craving. You are in love and you want the feeling to last forever, and the fear that it will not last is a constant shadow beneath the joy. That is craving. You are exhausted by life and you want the whole thing to stop, not to die exactly, but to not have to keep going, to not have to keep wanting and striving and failing and starting again. That is also craving, the craving for pleasure, the craving for permanence, the craving for escape. These are the three engines of suffering, and they run continuously, day and night, in every mind that has not learned to see them for what they are. The Buddha's analysis is ruthless in its implications. It means that the suffering you experience when you lose something you love is not caused by the loss itself. It is caused by the craving that made the loss painful. The thing you loved was always impermanent. You knew this on some level from the beginning, but you craved its permanence, you wanted it to last, and when it did not last, the gap between what you wanted and what happened was experienced as pain. The loss is real, the grief is real, but the suffering itself arises from the craving, not from the event. This is a hard teaching. It can sound, on first hearing, like victim blaming, like telling a person who has lost a child that the problem is their attachment, not their loss. The Buddha was not that callous. The early texts record moments of great compassion and emotional sensitivity. When his closest disciple wept at the news that the Buddha was about to die, the Buddha did not tell him to stop craving. He comforted him. He acknowledged the grief. But the teaching stands as a structural analysis, not as a therapeutic response to any individual person's pain. The question is not whether grief is appropriate. The question is why grief exists at all, what mechanism produces it, and whether that mechanism can be understood deeply enough that its hold on the mind is loosened. The third noble truth: the cessation of suffering is possible. The tradition calls this the extinguishing, a blowing out, the way a flame is blown out, and what is extinguished is not the self, but the fires of craving, aversion, and delusion. It is not a place. It is not heaven. It is not a state of bliss in the way that bliss is ordinarily understood. It is the absence of suffering, and the tradition insists that this absence is not merely negative, not merely the removal of something bad, but something positive in its own right, an unconditioned state that is beyond the reach of impermanence because it was never conditioned in the first place. The Buddha described this liberation with notable restraint. He did not rhapsodize about it. He did not paint vivid pictures of eternal happiness. In one early collection of inspired utterances attributed to the Buddha, there is a passage that comes as close as anything in the earliest canon to a positive description. There is, monks, an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned. If there were not this unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned, no escape would be discerned from what is born, become, made, conditioned. But since there is an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned, therefore an escape is discerned from what is born, become, made, conditioned. The passage does not say what liberation is, it says what it is not. It is not born, not made, not conditioned. It is defined entirely by negation, and this negation is deliberate. The Buddha consistently refused to describe it in positive terms, because any positive description would turn it into another object of craving, another thing the mind could grasp at, and grasping is precisely what liberation is the end of. The refusal to describe this liberation positively is not evasiveness. It is philosophical precision. The Buddha understood that language is itself a tool of craving. When you describe something desirable, the mind reaches for it. When you paint a picture of paradise, the mind wants to go there. And wanting to go there is craving, the very thing that liberation is the cessation of. To describe it in glowing terms would be to turn it into one more object of desire, one more destination the mind could chase, and the chasing would prevent the arriving. The silence is not a failure to communicate, it is the communication. Liberation is not something you get. It is what remains when the getting stops. The fourth noble truth. The path leading to the cessation of suffering is the noble Eightfold Path. This is the prescription, the treatment, the method. It is not a set of beliefs to be accepted. It is a set of practices to be undertaken. The Buddha compared it to a raft for crossing a river. Once you have crossed, you do not carry the raft on your head. The path is instrumental, not sacred. It is valued for what it does, not for what it is. The structure of the Four Noble Truths is itself significant. It moves from observation to analysis to possibility to practice. It begins with what is the case, moves to why it is the case, then to the claim that it does not have to be the case, and finally to the method for making it not the case. This structure is not accidental. It is the structure of rational inquiry applied to the problem of suffering. And the fact that the Buddha chose this structure tells us something about the kind of thinker he was. He was not a mystic in the sense of someone who relies on ineffable experience rather than reasoned argument. He was not a prophet in the sense of someone who claims to speak on behalf of a divine authority. He was a philosopher who had identified a problem, analyzed its causes, and proposed a solution. The solution might be wrong. The analysis might be flawed. But the method is rational, empirical, and testable. This is worth emphasizing because it distinguishes the Buddha's approach from the approaches of many of his contemporaries and many of his successors. In the religious landscape of ancient India, authority typically rested on one of three foundations: the authority of scripture, specifically the old sacred hymns, the authority of a teacher's personal spiritual attainment, or the authority of logical argument. The Buddha's relationship to all three was complex. He rejected the authority of those scriptures, which put him in direct conflict with the priestly establishment. He claimed personal attainment, the awakening under the tree. But he did not ask anyone to take his attainment on faith, and he used logical argument extensively, but always in the service of a practical goal, the end of suffering. One of the most frequently cited discourses in the earliest canon captures this attitude with remarkable clarity. A group of townspeople come to the Buddha and tell him that they are confused. Many teachers have passed through their town, each proclaiming his own doctrine and disparaging the doctrines of others. How are they supposed to know who is right? The Buddha's response is striking. Do not go by oral tradition, he says. Do not go by lineage of teaching. Do not go by hearsay. Do not go by a collection of scriptures. Do not go by logical reasoning alone. Do not go by inferential reasoning alone. Do not go by reasoned consideration. Do not go by the acceptance of a view after pondering it. Do not go by the seeming competence of a speaker. Do not go by the thought, this contemplative is our teacher. When you know for yourselves that these things are wholesome, blameless, praised by the wise, and when undertaken and practiced lead to welfare and happiness, then you should enter upon and abide in them. This passage has sometimes been read as an endorsement of radical skepticism or personal relativism. It is neither. The Buddha is not saying that every person's opinion is equally valid. He is saying that the test of a teaching is its results. Does it reduce suffering? Does it lead to wisdom? Does it produce genuine well-being? If so, practice it. If not, discard it. The authority is not the teacher. The authority is the outcome. The Four Noble Truths, then, are not articles of faith. They are hypotheses about the nature of experience, offered by a man who claimed to have verified them in his own consciousness and who invited others to do the same. The first truth is an observation. Life is characterized by suffering. The second is an analysis. The cause of suffering is craving. The third is a prediction. If the cause is removed, the effect will cease. And the fourth is a prescription. Here is how to remove the cause. The entire structure stands or falls on whether the treatment works. And the treatment is the Eightfold Path. The path is not a staircase. This is the first thing that needs to be understood about the Noble Eightfold Path, and it is the thing that is most frequently misunderstood. The 8 factors are not stages to be completed in sequence, where you master the first before moving to the second, and the second before the third. They are more like the 8 strands of a rope, each one woven together with all the others, each one supporting and being supported by the rest. You do not practice right speech until you have perfected it, and then move on to right action. You practice right speech and right action, and right livelihood, and all the others simultaneously, each one deepening your capacity for the others, all of them working together as a single integrated discipline. The word translated as right in each factor carries a richer meaning than the English word suggests. It means complete, whole, perfect, or correct in the sense of properly aligned, the way a wheel is aligned on its axle. When the axle sits properly, the wheel turns smoothly. When it does not, there is friction, wobble, suffering. The Eightfold Path is an alignment practice. It aligns the mind, the body, and the conduct of life, so that the whole system works without the friction that produces suffering. The 8 factors fall into 3 groups, and these groups are themselves instructive. The first group is wisdom, which includes right view and right intention. The second is ethical conduct, which includes right speech, right action, and right livelihood. The third is mental discipline, which includes right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Wisdom, ethics, and discipline. Understanding, behavior, and training of the mind. The path addresses the whole person, not just the intellect, not just the body, not just the emotions, but all of them together. Right view is the foundation. It means seeing things as they actually are, not as you want them to be, or as convention tells you they are. In practical terms, right view is the understanding of the Four Noble Truths, that life is characterized by suffering, that suffering arises from craving, that craving can cease, and that there is a path to its cessation. But right view also includes a broader understanding of the nature of reality, that all things are impermanent, that there is no permanent self, that actions have consequences. Right view is not a belief system, it is a way of seeing. The difference is that a belief system tells you what to think about the world. Right view tells you to look at the world clearly and see what is actually there. Right intention follows from right view. If you see clearly, certain intentions naturally arise and others naturally fall away. The Buddha identified 3 forms of right intention: the intention of renunciation, the willingness to let go of what does not serve liberation, the intention of goodwill, the genuine wish for the welfare of all beings, and the intention of harmlessness, the commitment to not causing unnecessary suffering. These are not commandments imposed from outside. They are the natural expression of a mind that has begun to see clearly. When you understand that clinging causes suffering, the intention to let go arises naturally. When you understand that all beings are caught in the same predicament, goodwill arises naturally. When you understand the mechanics of suffering, the intention to not add to the world's supply of it arises naturally. Right speech is the first of the ethical factors, and the Buddha gave it a specificity that is worth noting. Right speech means abstaining from lying, from divisive speech, from harsh speech, and from idle chatter. Each of these is a form of verbal action that creates suffering, either in others or in yourself. Lying distorts reality and erodes trust. Divisive speech creates conflict. Harsh speech inflicts pain. And idle chatter, perhaps surprisingly included in a list of serious ethical transgressions, wastes the limited time and energy that could be directed toward liberation. The Buddha was not a Puritan about conversation. The texts record him engaging in discussions of all kinds, some of them quite extended, but he drew a line at speech that served no purpose other than to fill silence or to entertain the ego. Right action addresses the body. The traditional formulation includes abstaining from killing, from stealing, and from sexual misconduct. These are not arbitrary rules. They are practical consequences of the understanding that all beings wish to be free from suffering. If you understand suffering, you understand that the creature in front of you, whether human or animal, is experiencing a version of the same predicament you are experiencing. To add to its suffering through violence, theft, or exploitation is to work against the very understanding that the path is designed to cultivate. Right action is not obedience to a divine command. It is consistency with insight. If you see that suffering is the problem, you do not deliberately cause more of it. Right livelihood extends this principle to how you earn your living. The Buddha specifically named 5 forms of livelihood that are incompatible with the path: trading in weapons, trading in living beings, trading in meat, trading in intoxicants, and trading in poison. These categories are not comprehensive, and later Buddhist traditions have elaborated considerably on the principle. But the underlying logic is clear. Your work should not depend on the suffering of others. If your livelihood requires you to deceive, to exploit, to harm, then your livelihood is an obstacle to liberation, no matter how much money it produces. The point is consistency. You cannot spend 8 hours a day engaged in activity that generates suffering and then expect an hour of meditation in the evening to undo the damage. The path is not a compartment of your life, it is your life, and a livelihood that contradicts the path undermines everything the other 7 factors are trying to build. Right effort is the first of the mental discipline factors, and it is one of the most psychologically astute elements of the path. The Buddha described 4 aspects of right effort: preventing unwholesome states of mind from arising, abandoning unwholesome states that have already arisen, cultivating wholesome states that have not yet arisen, and maintaining wholesome states that are already present. This is a complete program for working with the contents of consciousness. It recognizes that the mind is not passive. It does not simply receive experience. It actively generates states of greed, anger, confusion, generosity, compassion, and clarity, and the practitioner can learn to influence which states arise and which ones are sustained. The word effort is important. The Buddha did not teach that liberation happens automatically, that you simply need to relax and let go, and everything will take care of itself. He taught that liberation requires sustained, deliberate work. The mind has habits. It has tendencies. It has deeply ingrained patterns of craving and aversion that have been reinforced over a lifetime and, according to the Buddhist understanding, over countless lifetimes. These patterns do not dissolve on their own. They require effort to change, but the effort must be balanced. Too much effort creates tension. Too little allows the old patterns to reassert themselves. This is the middle way applied to the training of the mind. Enough effort to make progress, not so much that the effort itself becomes a form of striving. Right mindfulness is perhaps the most widely known element of the path in the contemporary world, largely because of the global spread of mindfulness-based practices that draw on Buddhist tradition. But the Buddha's concept of mindfulness is more specific and more demanding than what the word typically conveys in modern usage. It means awareness, remembering, keeping in mind. Right mindfulness is the practice of maintaining continuous clear awareness of four domains: the body, feelings, mind states, and mental objects or phenomena. The classic text on this practice is the Discourse on the Foundations of Mindfulness, which describes in detail how the practitioner is to observe each domain. The observation is not passive. It is not simply sitting still and noticing whatever happens. It is a directed, systematic investigation of experience. You observe the body as a body, not as my body, not with identification, but with the detached clarity of someone watching a natural process. You observe feelings as feelings, noting whether they are pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, without adding the layer of craving or aversion that normally accompanies them. You observe mind states as mind states, recognizing greed as greed when it arises, anger as anger, confusion as confusion, not suppressing these states but seeing them clearly for what they are. And you observe mental objects, the hindrances, the aggregates, the sense bases, the factors of awakening, recognizing how the mind constructs experience and how that construction can be deconstructed. The purpose of this practice is not relaxation, though relaxation may be a side effect. The purpose is insight. The purpose is to see, through direct, sustained observation, that everything that arises in experience is impermanent, that it arises in dependence on conditions, and that there is no permanent self behind or beneath the flow. When this is seen clearly enough, when it is not just an idea but a direct perception, the craving that depends on the illusion of permanence and selfhood begins to dissolve. Not because you have decided to stop craving, but because the conditions that support craving have been removed. Right concentration is the final factor of the path, and it refers to the deep, focused states of meditation known as the meditative absorptions. The Buddha described 4 primary absorptions, each one more refined than the last. In the first, the mind is withdrawn from sensory experience and settled on its meditation object, accompanied by applied and sustained thought, joy, and happiness. In the second, applied and sustained thoughts cease, and the mind rests in a state of inner clarity, joy, and happiness. In the third, joy fades, and the mind rests in equanimity and happiness. In the fourth, even happiness gives way to a pure, even equanimity, a state of perfect balance in which the mind is neither pleased nor displeased, neither reaching toward anything nor pulling away from anything. These states are not the goal. This is a point the Buddha made repeatedly and emphatically. The absorptions are tools. They develop the stability and clarity of mind that make insight possible. A scattered mind cannot see clearly. A mind agitated by craving and aversion cannot observe its own processes with the detachment that insight requires. The absorptions calm the mind. They concentrate it. They create the conditions under which right mindfulness can do its work. But if concentration is practiced without wisdom, if the meditator becomes attached to the pleasant states themselves, then the practice becomes another form of craving, another obstacle to liberation. This is precisely what the Buddha found insufficient in the practices of his first two teachers. They could produce profound states of concentration, but they could not produce insight, and without insight, the states were temporary refugees from suffering rather than a permanent resolution of it. The Buddha's insistence on the limitations of concentration without insight is one of the most distinctive features of his teaching. Many contemplative traditions, both in ancient India and in the modern world, treat deep meditative states as ends in themselves, as evidence of spiritual attainment, as the goal of the entire enterprise. The Buddha said no. The absorptions are magnificent tools, but they are tools. A hammer that is never used to build anything is just a piece of metal. Concentration that does not lead to wisdom is just a pleasant trance. The question is always the same. Does this practice lead to the end of suffering? If it does, pursue it. If it does not, set it aside. The relationship between the three groups is circular, not linear. Wisdom informs ethical conduct. Ethical conduct supports mental discipline. Mental discipline deepens wisdom. And the deeper wisdom in turn refines ethical conduct and mental discipline further. The path is a feedback loop, a self-reinforcing system in which each element strengthens all the others. You cannot practice meditation effectively if your life is full of harm and deception, because the guilt and agitation will prevent concentration. You cannot sustain ethical conduct without the insight that makes you understand why ethical conduct matters. And you cannot achieve the insight that ends suffering without the concentrated, mindful mind that meditation develops. This integration is one of the most distinctive features of the Buddha's teaching. Many philosophical systems separate theory from practice, treating understanding as one thing and action as another. The Buddha refused this separation. Understanding and action are the same project. To understand suffering is to begin acting differently. To act differently is to understand more deeply. The path is not a ladder you climb from ignorance to enlightenment. It is a wheel that turns, each rotation deepening both understanding and practice, each rotation bringing the practitioner closer to the cessation of suffering that the Buddha claimed was possible for every human being who was willing to do the work. Of all the claims the Buddha made, this one cuts the deepest. There is no self. Not that the self is hard to find, or that the self is different from what you think it is, or that the self needs to be improved or purified or transcended. There is no self. The thing you have spent your entire life protecting, promoting, worrying about, comparing to others, and trying to make happy does not exist in the way you think it does. This is the doctrine of non-self, and it is the most radical and most misunderstood element of the Buddha's philosophy. Start with what you think you are. You think you are a person, a continuous, unified entity that persists through time, that has a past you remember and a future you anticipate, that is the same person who woke up this morning, and the same person who went to sleep last night, and the same person who existed 10 years ago, changed in many ways, but fundamentally essentially the same. This sense of selfhood is so pervasive and so immediate that questioning it can feel absurd. Of course there is a self. Who is asking the question if there is no self? The Buddha's answer to this objection is not a denial that experience exists. He never said that nothing is happening. He said that what is happening is not what you think is happening. What you call a self is actually a process, a constantly changing stream of events that has no fixed core, no permanent essence, no unchanging center. The stream is real. The events are real. But the self that you imagine to be behind the events, owning them, directing them, is a construction. It is a story the mind tells about the stream, and the story has become so familiar that it is mistaken for the stream itself. The Buddha analyzed this stream into 5 components, which he called the 5 aggregates. The first is form, which includes the physical body and the material world that the body encounters through the senses. The second is feeling, which does not mean emotion in the ordinary sense, but the bare quality of pleasantness, unpleasantness, or neutrality that accompanies every moment of experience. The third is perception, the mental faculty that recognizes and categorizes what is encountered. This is red, this is loud, this is my mother's voice. The fourth is mental formations, a large and diverse category that includes intentions, volitions, attitudes, emotions, habits, and all the active mental processes that shape experience. The fifth is consciousness, the bare awareness that knows what is present. These 5 aggregates are not components of a self. They are what the self is mistakenly believed to consist of. The Buddha's claim is that if you examine any of these aggregates carefully, you will find that none of them qualifies as a self in the way the self is ordinarily understood. None of them is permanent. None of them is fully under your control. None of them is you, in the sense that you use the word when you say, I am happy, or I am afraid, or I am the same person I was yesterday. The discourse on the characteristic of non-self is the text in which the Buddha first presented this teaching. It was the second formal sermon delivered to the same 5 ascetics at the deer park shortly after the discourse on the 4 noble truths. The argument is devastatingly simple. The Buddha takes each aggregate in turn and asks 3 questions. Is it permanent or impermanent? It is impermanent. If it is impermanent, is it satisfying or unsatisfying? It is unsatisfying. If it is impermanent and unsatisfying, is it fitting to regard it as, this is mine, this is what I am, this is myself? It is not. The logic is compressed but powerful. A self, by definition, would be something you own, something you control, something that is truly yours. But your body changes without your permission. Your feelings arise and pass away regardless of what you want. Your perceptions shift with every new input. Your mental formations, your moods, your intentions, your dispositions change from hour to hour, from minute to minute. Even consciousness, the awareness that seems to be the bedrock of identity, is itself conditioned and changing, arising in dependence on the sense organs and their objects, flickering into existence and passing away with each new moment of experience. None of these aggregates is stable enough to be a self. None of them is controllable enough to be a self. And if the self is not any one of them, and if there is nothing else apart from them, then the self is a word for something that does not have a referent. This is the point where most people resist. The resistance takes many forms. Some people argue that the self is the sum of the aggregates, that even though no single aggregate is the self, the combination of all 5 is. The Buddha anticipated this objection. If the self were the sum of the aggregates, it would change whenever any aggregate changed, which means it would change constantly, which means it would not be a self in any meaningful sense. It would be a label for a process, not a name for a thing. Other people argue that there must be something behind the aggregates, a soul, an observer, a pure consciousness that watches the aggregates come and go without being affected by them. The Buddha rejected this as well. Search for this observer, he said. Look for it. Where is it? Is it in the body? Is it in the feelings? Is it in the consciousness? If you look carefully, honestly, without the preconception that it must be there, you will not find it. What you will find is more aggregates, more processes, more arising and passing away. The experiment is worth trying. Sit quietly for a moment and try to find the self, not the body, which is a physical object in space, not the thoughts which come and go unbidden, not the feelings which shift from moment to moment like weather, not the awareness of these things, which is itself arising and passing away with each new object of attention. Where is the self? What is it made of? If you look honestly, what you find is not a self, but a continuous stream of experiences, each one arising, persisting for a moment, and giving way to the next. The stream is real. The experiences are real. But the experiencer, the one who is supposed to be having the experiences, is nowhere to be found. It is like looking for the center of a river. The water flows, but there is no fixed point around which it flows. The flow is all there is. The teaching of non-self is not nihilism. The Buddha was adamant about this, and the early texts record him correcting the misunderstanding on multiple occasions. Nihilism, in the Buddhist context, is the view that nothing exists, that there is no continuity between actions and their consequences, that death is the end and nothing matters. The Buddha explicitly rejected this view. Actions have consequences. What you do now shapes what happens next. There is a continuity to experience, a causal chain that connects one moment to the next, and according to the Buddhist understanding, one life to the next. But this continuity is not the continuity of a self. It is the continuity of a process. The way a flame passed from one candle to another is in some sense the same flame and in some sense not. The way the river you step into today is connected to the river you stepped into yesterday, but is not the same water. The flame analogy is one of the most famous in Buddhist literature, and it appears in a dialogue between a Buddhist monk and a Greek king, recorded in a text composed several centuries after the Buddha's death, but one that captures the philosophical spirit of the early teaching with remarkable clarity. The king asks the monk whether the flame that burns in the first watch of the night is the same flame that burns in the last watch. The monk says it is not. But there is a continuity, the king protests. The flame depends on the flame before it. Yes, says the monk, and in the same way, one moment of consciousness depends on the moment before it, one life depends on the life before it. But the thing that continues is not a self. It is a process. The practical implications of non-self are enormous, and they cut in directions that are simultaneously liberating and terrifying. If there is no self, then there is nothing to defend. The vast architecture of self-protection that most people spend their lives constructing, the ego, the image, the story of who I am and why I matter, is a fortification built around something that is not there. You are defending an empty room. And the energy spent on this defense, the anxiety, the competitiveness, the fear of failure, the need for recognition, the dread of insignificance, is energy wasted on a project that was misconceived from the start. The liberation is that when you stop defending the self, the suffering that came from the defense stops too. The terror is that there is nothing to hold on to, no fixed point, no ground beneath the ground. The Buddha did not deny conventional selfhood. He used the words I and you and mine in ordinary conversation. He referred to himself and to others as distinct individuals. What he denied was that these conventional designations refer to something ultimately real, something permanent and independent that exists beneath or behind the flow of experience. The self is a useful fiction. It is the way human beings navigate the world, the way they make plans, form relationships, take responsibility for their actions. But it is a fiction nonetheless, and mistaking the fiction for reality is one of the root causes of suffering. This mistake has a name in the Buddhist system. It is called identity view, the deeply ingrained, usually unconscious belief that there is a self at the center of experience. This is not an intellectual belief. It is a felt sense, a pre-reflective certainty, woven into the very structure of perception and cognition. You do not decide to believe in a self. You experience a self before you are old enough to decide anything. And uprooting this experience requires more than intellectual argument. It requires the sustained, direct observation of the aggregates through the practice of mindfulness, the repeated seeing, not thinking but seeing, that form arises and passes away, that feeling arises and passes away, that perception, mental formations, and consciousness all arise and pass away, and that there is nothing behind the arising and passing away that remains when they are gone. The relationship between non-self and suffering is direct and essential. We suffer because we cling. We cling because we believe there is a self that needs to be protected, satisfied, and perpetuated. If the self is seen through, if the fiction is recognized as a fiction, then the clinging loses its foundation. You do not stop experiencing. You do not become a blank, emotionless void. What changes is the relationship to experience. Experience continues, but the frantic grasping at experience, the attempt to hold on to what is pleasant and push away what is unpleasant and maintain the illusion of a stable, permanent self through all of it, that grasping relaxes. And in its relaxation is the beginning of the end of suffering. The Buddha's position on the self occupies a precise philosophical space. On one side is the eternalist view, held by the priestly class and by most Hindu philosophical schools, that there is an eternal self, a permanent, unchanging soul that survives death and is ultimately identical with a single cosmic principle. On the other side is the annihilationist view, that the self is real but is destroyed at death, that this life is the only one, and that death is the final end. The Buddha rejected both. There is no permanent self to survive death, but there is no permanent self to be destroyed at death either. What continues is the process, the stream of causally connected events that flows from one moment to the next, and, in the Buddhist understanding, from one life to the next, without any self riding the stream like a passenger on a boat. This middle position is difficult to hold, and the history of Buddhism is in many ways the history of the difficulty. Later Buddhist schools would develop elaborate philosophical systems to explain how rebirth is possible without a self, how moral responsibility works without an agent, how liberation is meaningful without someone who is liberated. These are genuine philosophical problems, and the Buddha's own solution, the doctrine of dependent origination, which explains how the process continues without a self, is the subject to which we must now turn. There is a river in northern India where pilgrims have been bathing for thousands of years. The water that flows past the stone steps today is not the water that flowed past them yesterday. The banks have shifted. The depth has changed. The sediment that the current carries is different sediment from different soil, washed from different fields by different rains. And yet people call it the same river. They give it the same name. They treat it as a continuous thing, a fixed feature of the landscape, even though every element of it is in flux. This is what the Buddha meant by impermanence, and the river is not a metaphor. The river is the easy case. Everything else is harder to see. The concept is impermanence, unstable, inconstant. And the Buddha's claim is not that some things are impermanent while others endure. The claim is that everything in the conditioned world, every physical object, every mental state, every relationship, every institution, every sensation, every thought is impermanent. There are no exceptions. There is nothing you can point to and say, this will last. Not your body, not your mind, not the person you love, not the civilization you live in, not the ground beneath your feet. Everything that has arisen will pass away. Everything that has been assembled will come apart. Everything that has been born will die. This observation is so obvious that it barely seems worth stating. Everyone knows that things change. Everyone knows that people die. Everyone knows that the body ages, that relationships end, that empires fall. The Buddha was not announcing a discovery. He was pointing out that the knowledge most people have of impermanence is intellectual, theoretical, and therefore functionally useless. We know that things change in the same way that we know the Earth orbits the Sun, abstractly, as a fact filed away in the mind but not felt in the bones. The Buddha's claim is that truly seeing impermanence, not as a concept but as a direct, lived perception of the texture of experience in every moment, is transformative. It changes everything. Consider the body. You inhabit what feels like a stable physical structure. You look in the mirror and you see what appears to be the same face you saw last week, last month, last year. But the appearance of stability is an illusion produced by the slowness of the change relative to the frequency of observation. The cells in your body are continuously dying and being replaced. The molecules that compose those cells are drawn from the food you eat, the water you drink, the air you breathe, and they will be returned to the environment when the cells break down. The body you have today is not, in any material sense, the body you had 7 years ago. It is a pattern, a form that persists while its contents cycle through, the way a wave persists while the water that composes it is constantly changing. The Buddha did not know about cells or molecules, but he did not need to. His observation was made at the level of direct experience, not at the level of biology. Watch the body for an hour. Really watch it. The breath comes and goes. The heart beats and pauses and beats again. Sensations arise on the skin, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, and dissolve before you can fully grasp them. Warmth gives way to coolness. Tension gives way to relaxation. The body is not a thing. It is an event, a continuous process of arising and passing away, and the sense of solidity is a product of inattention, the way a spinning wheel looks like a solid disc if you are not watching carefully. The same is true of mental states. You feel happy, and the happiness feels like a condition, a state you are in, something stable. But watch it. The happiness is made of moments, individual flickers of pleasant feeling that arise and pass away so quickly that they blend together into what seems like a continuous state. Interrupt the flow, introduce a single thought, a memory, a worry, and the happiness wobbles, shifts, becomes something else. It was never solid. It was a rapid sequence of events that the mind smoothed into a seeming continuity, the way a film produces the illusion of motion from a sequence of still images. This insight has a precision that distinguishes it from vague philosophical musings about the passage of time. The Buddha was not simply saying that time passes and things change. He was making a specific claim about the structure of experience, that every element of experience arises in dependence on conditions, persists for a moment, and passes away when those conditions change. There is no experience that lasts. There is no state that endures. Even the states that feel most stable, deep concentration, profound peace, intense love, are composed of moments, and each moment is followed by a new moment that is similar but not identical. The sense of continuity is a construction, and the construction is so seamless that it goes unnoticed. The Buddha's practice of mindfulness is, among other things, a method for slowing down perception to the point where the construction becomes visible, where you can see the gaps between the moments, the points where one experience ends and another begins. The philosophical implications of impermanence extend in every direction. If everything is impermanent, then attachment to anything is attachment to something that is already in the process of disappearing. This is not a judgment about whether attachment is morally right or wrong. It is an observation about the structure of the situation. You fall in love. The person you love is changing. You are changing. The relationship between you is changing. The love itself is changing. None of this change is necessarily bad. Change can bring growth, deepening, new dimensions of connection and understanding. But the change means that what you are attached to is not a fixed thing. It is a process. And attachment to a process, the desire for it to remain the same, to not change, to not end, is a desire that the nature of reality cannot fulfill. We can see this in the way we relate to the past. The memory of a happy time is never simply a memory. It is a memory tinged with the knowledge that the time is gone. The photograph of a younger self is never simply a photograph. It is evidence of loss, proof that the person in the image no longer exists, that the body has changed, the face has changed, the circumstances have changed. Nostalgia is impermanence experienced emotionally. It is the feeling of reaching for something that the passage of time has placed beyond reach, and the sweetness of the memory is inseparable from the pain of its inaccessibility. The Buddha would say that the pain is not in the memory, it is in the reaching. This is where suffering and impermanence intersect. Suffering arises not from impermanence itself, but from the collision between impermanence and desire. The things themselves are neutral. A flower blooms and wilts. A cloud forms and disperses. A day begins and ends. There is no suffering in any of this considered on its own. The suffering enters when a mind that craves permanence encounters a world that offers none. You want the flower to stay in bloom. You want the day to not end. You want the person to not change, to not age, to not die. And the world says no, not cruelly, not deliberately, but inevitably. The world says no because the world is not built to say yes to this particular request. The Buddha drew a practical conclusion from this analysis that is as challenging as any claim in the history of philosophy. If attachment to impermanent things causes suffering, then the reduction of attachment reduces suffering. This does not mean becoming cold, indifferent, or emotionally dead. The early texts do not describe the Buddha as a man without feelings. They describe him as a man whose feelings were not distorted by clinging. He could appreciate beauty without needing it to last. He could care for people without needing them to be other than what they were. He could experience pleasure without the anxiety that the pleasure would end. The difference is subtle but significant. It is the difference between holding something with an open hand and holding it with a closed fist. In both cases you are holding it. But when you hold with an open hand, the pain of letting go is absent because you were never gripping in the first place. There is a teaching in which the Buddha compares the practitioner to a person watching a river from the bank. The water flows past. Leaves and branches float by. Foam gathers and disperses. The person on the bank does not try to stop the river, does not try to hold the water in place, does not weep when a particular swirl of current passes and is replaced by another. The person watches. The watching is attentive, clear, fully present, but it is not grasping. The river is the stream of experience. The leaves and branches are the events of life. And the bank is the practice of mindfulness, the place from which you can see the flow without being swept away by it. Impermanence also means that nothing is permanently bad. This is the other side of the teaching, the side that is often overlooked in presentations that emphasize the Buddha's diagnosis of suffering. If nothing lasts, then suffering does not last either. The pain you feel right now will pass. The grief that seems unbearable will change its character over time, not because you have forgotten or because the loss has healed, but because the grief itself is a process, and processes are impermanent. The darkest night of the soul is still a night, and nights end. This is not false comfort. It is the same observation applied in a different direction. The person who understands impermanence does not just see that joy passes. They also see that sorrow passes. Both are temporary, both are real, neither is permanent. The Buddha applied the principle of impermanence with particular force to the question of identity. If everything changes, then the person you call yourself is also changing. The you of this moment is not the you of the last moment. The you of this year is not the you of last year. What you call your personality, your character, your identity is a pattern, like the pattern of a river or the pattern of a flame. The pattern has a continuity, a recognizable shape, but it is not a thing. It is a way that change happens. And the deep, usually unconscious identification with this pattern, the feeling that there is a real, permanent me beneath all the changes, is precisely the illusion that the teaching of non-self addresses. Impermanence and non-self are not two separate doctrines. They are two aspects of a single insight. Things change, and the thing you think you are, the self, is one of the things that changes. These two observations, taken together, undermine the deepest assumptions of ordinary experience. They undermine the assumption that there is a stable world out there and a stable self in here that perceives it. What there is, the Buddha taught, is a continuous dynamic process of arising and passing away, a process that includes both what we call the world and what we call the self, and the distinction between them is itself a product of the process, not a feature of an independent reality. The contemplation of impermanence is one of the central practices in the Buddhist tradition. Monks and nuns in the traditional southern school are encouraged to visit charnel grounds, to observe bodies in various stages of decomposition, to reflect on the fact that their own bodies will one day look like that. This practice sounds morbid, and in a culture that prefers not to think about death, it is. But the purpose is not to produce horror or despair. The purpose is to make impermanence real, to move it from the category of things you know intellectually to the category of things you feel in the marrow of your bones. Because when you feel impermanence that deeply, the clinging begins to loosen on its own. Not through force of will, but through the clear perception that there is nothing to cling to. The hand opens because the thing it was gripping has been seen to be made of air. Everything changes. The body changes. The mind changes. The world changes. The person who started reading this chapter is not the person who is reading this sentence. Something has shifted, however slightly, and the shift is real. The Buddha's invitation is to see the shifting, not to stop it, not to resist it, not to grieve over it, but to see it clearly, fully, without the overlay of desire that turns a natural process into a source of suffering. The flower blooms. The flower wilts. That is what flowers do. The question is whether you can watch it happen without needing it to be otherwise. The Buddha was once asked whether suffering is caused by oneself or by another. He rejected both options. Suffering, he said, arises in dependence on conditions. This answer sounds like a dodge, a philosopher's trick for avoiding a direct question. It is not. It is the foundation of the most sophisticated and most important philosophical contribution the Buddha made, the doctrine of dependent origination. If the Four Noble Truths are the diagnosis, Dependent origination is the X-ray. It shows you the internal structure of the disease. The principle itself can be stated in a single sentence. When this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. With the cessation of this, that ceases. This is the formula that appears again and again in the early texts, and its simplicity is deceptive. It is saying that nothing in the world of experience exists independently. Everything arises because of conditions. Everything passes away when those conditions change. There is no first cause, no uncaused cause, no prime mover that set the whole thing in motion. There is only an unbroken web of conditions giving rise to other conditions, stretching in every direction without beginning or end. This is not the same as saying that everything is caused. Causation, in the Western philosophical sense, typically implies a linear relationship. A causes B, B causes C. Dependent origination is more complex. It describes a network of mutual conditioning in which each element both depends on and supports other elements. The flame depends on the fuel depends on the fire, the organism depends on the environment is shaped by the organism, the observer depends on the observed is constituted in part by the act of observation. This is not mysticism. It is a systematic refusal to isolate any single factor and call it the cause. Because in a world of interconnected conditions, isolating a single cause is always an oversimplification. The Buddha applied this principle specifically to the problem of suffering through a teaching known as the 12 links of dependent origination. This is a chain of 12 conditions, each one giving rise to the next, that explains how suffering arises and, crucially, how it can cease. The 12 links are ignorance, mental formations, consciousness, name and form, the 6 sense bases, contact, feeling, craving, clinging, becoming, birth, and aging and death. Together they describe the complete mechanism of the cycle of suffering that keeps beings trapped in an endless round of birth, death, and rebirth. The chain begins with ignorance, not ignorance in the sense of lacking information, but a fundamental misperception of the nature of reality. The ignorant mind sees permanence where there is impermanence. It sees a self where there is no self. It sees satisfaction where there is suffering. This ignorance is not a moral failing. It is not a punishment. It is simply the default condition of a mind that has not been trained to see clearly. And from this default condition, everything else follows. Ignorance conditions mental formations. These are the volitional activities of the mind, the intentions and impulses that shape the quality of consciousness. When the mind is rooted in ignorance, its intentions are coloured by craving, aversion, and delusion. These intentions are actions in the Buddhist sense, and they have consequences. They shape the character of consciousness, inclining it in certain directions, establishing patterns that will continue to unfold. Mental formations condition consciousness. Consciousness here is not a permanent observer, but a process of awareness that arises in dependence on its conditions. The consciousness conditioned by ignorance and volitional activity is a consciousness oriented toward grasping, toward seeking satisfaction in impermanent things, toward constructing and maintaining the illusion of a permanent self. This consciousness is not neutral. It carries the imprint of what came before, the way a river carries the sediment of the land it has passed through. Consciousness conditions name and form. Name refers to the mental components of experience, feeling, perception, intention, contact, attention. Form refers to the physical components, the body, the material world. Together, name and form is the psychophysical organism, the entity that we conventionally call a person. The key insight is that name and form does not exist independently. It arises in dependence on consciousness, and consciousness in turn depends on name and form. They co-arise, they condition each other. There is no consciousness without a body-mind to be conscious in, and there is no body-mind without consciousness to animate it. Name and form conditions the 6 sense bases: the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. In the Buddhist analysis, the mind is treated as a sense organ, with thoughts and mental objects as its field, just as colours are the field of the eye and sounds are the field of the ear. The 6 sense bases are the doors through which the organism encounters the world. They arise because there is a psychophysical organism to house them, and they in turn make possible the next link in the chain. The 6 sense bases condition contact. Contact is the meeting of a sense organ, a sense object, and consciousness. When the eye meets a visible form and visual consciousness arises, there is contact. When the ear meets a sound and auditory consciousness arises, there is contact. Contact is the point at which the organism and the world come together, and it is happening continuously in every moment of waking experience. There is no gap. There is no moment without contact, without the ongoing collision between the senses and their objects. Contact conditions feeling. Here, as in the discussion of the aggregates, feeling does not mean emotion. It means the hedonic tone of experience, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Every moment of contact produces a feeling. The taste of food produces a pleasant or unpleasant feeling. The sound of a voice produces a pleasant or unpleasant feeling. A thought produces a pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feeling. This is automatic. It happens before you have time to think about it, before you can decide how to respond. The feeling is simply there, as immediate as the contact that produced it. Feeling conditions craving. This is the critical juncture. This is where the chain can be broken. The feeling arises, and the untrained mind immediately responds with craving. Craving for more of the pleasant. Craving for the cessation of the unpleasant. Craving for the neutral to become pleasant. The response feels automatic, inevitable, as though the craving is built into the feeling itself. But the Buddha's claim is that it is not. There is a gap between feeling and craving, a space in which the mind can respond differently. The feeling arises. It is pleasant. And the mind can simply note it as pleasant without reaching for more. The feeling arises. It is unpleasant. And the mind can simply note it as unpleasant without recoiling, without wanting it to stop. This is what mindfulness practice trains you to do, to inhabit the gap between feeling and craving, to see the feeling clearly without being driven by it into the automatic response of grasping or aversion. Craving conditions clinging. Clinging is craving solidified, craving that has become a commitment. Where craving is the reach, clinging is the grip. The texts identify 4 forms of clinging: clinging to sensory pleasures, clinging to views and opinions, clinging to rules and rituals, and clinging to a doctrine of self. Each of these is a way that the mind fastens itself to something impermanent and declares, "This is mine. This is what I need. This is what I am." And in each case, the clinging produces suffering because the thing being clung to will change, and the clinging will become a source of friction against the current of change. Clinging conditions becoming. Becoming is the process by which the mind's patterns of craving and clinging generate a new existence, a new mode of being. In the context of the Buddhist understanding of rebirth, becoming is what drives the transition from one life to the next, but it operates within a single life as well. Every act of clinging generates a becoming, a trajectory, a momentum that carries the mind in a particular direction. The person who clings to anger becomes an angry person. The person who clings to generosity becomes a generous person. Becoming is not a single event. It is a continuous process of self-creation, driven by the patterns of craving and clinging that the mind has established. Becoming conditions birth. In the most literal interpretation, this is the birth of a new being in a new life, driven by the accumulated force of the previous life's craving and clinging. But birth also operates at the level of moment-to-moment experience. Every moment of consciousness is a birth, the arising of a new configuration of the aggregates, a new instance of the process that we call experience. And every birth carries within it the conditions for the next link. Birth conditions aging and death, and with aging and death comes sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. The chain is complete. From ignorance, through a series of conditioned links, suffering arises. The wheel turns, and it turns again, and again. The genius of this teaching is not in the individual links, each of which describes a process that can be observed in direct experience, but in the structure of the whole. The 12 links form a circle, not a line. Aging and death do not end the chain. They produce the grief and despair that reinforce ignorance, which sets the whole process in motion again. This is the endless round, the wheel that turns without pause, driven by its own momentum. But the circle can be broken. This is the point. The chain of dependent origination is not a description of fate. It is a description of a mechanism, and mechanisms can be interrupted. If ignorance ceases, mental formations cease. If mental formations cease, the particular quality of consciousness that sustains the cycle ceases. And so on, link by link, until the entire chain collapses and suffering comes to an end. The most practical point of intervention, the place where the chain is most accessible to the practitioner, is the link between feeling and craving. This is where mindfulness does its most important work. You cannot prevent feelings from arising. As long as there are sense organs and sense objects and consciousness, there will be contact, and as long as there is contact, there will be feeling. But you can change what happens after the feeling arises. Instead of the automatic slide from pleasant feeling to craving for more, the mindful practitioner observes the feeling, recognizes it, and does not act on it. The craving, deprived of its fuel, does not arise. And if craving does not arise, clinging does not arise. And if clinging does not arise, the entire chain of becoming, birth, aging, death, and suffering is interrupted. This is not suppression. The Buddha was clear about this. Suppressing craving, pushing it down through force of will, is not the same as seeing through it. Suppression is itself a form of aversion, and aversion is itself a form of craving. What the Buddha taught was something more subtle, a clear, non-reactive awareness that sees craving arise, recognizes it for what it is, and lets it pass without feeding it. The craving is like a fire. If you add fuel, it burns. If you fight it, you get burned. But if you simply stop adding fuel, the fire goes out on its own. It goes out not because you have conquered it, but because the conditions that sustained it are no longer present. Dependent origination also explains why the Buddha refused to answer certain metaphysical questions. When asked whether the world is eternal or not eternal, whether the self exists after death or does not exist after death, the Buddha remained silent. These questions, he said, do not tend to edification. They do not lead to the end of suffering, and from the standpoint of dependent origination, they are badly formed. They assume that things either exist independently or do not exist at all. Dependent origination offers a third possibility. Things arise in dependence on conditions, persist as long as those conditions are present, and cease when the conditions change. They are not permanent, but they are not nothing. They are processes, and the question of whether a process exists in the same way that a thing exists is a question that dependent origination dissolves rather than answers. The teaching of dependent origination is, in many ways, the intellectual heart of the Buddha's philosophy. It unifies the other teachings, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, non-self, impermanence, into a single coherent system. It explains how suffering arises. It explains how the illusion of self is constructed. It explains how impermanence operates at the level of individual experience. And it points, with the precision of a medical diagnosis, to the exact place where the process can be interrupted and the suffering can end. A century before the Buddha was born, a Greek philosopher named Heraclitus, living in the city of Ephesus on the western coast of what is now Turkey, made a claim that sounds remarkably similar. Everything flows, Heraclitus said. You cannot step into the same river twice. The river changes. You change. The moment of stepping is already gone by the time you recognize it. Heraclitus saw flux at the heart of reality, a continuous becoming that never arrives at a stable being, and he saw it with such clarity that his fellow Greeks gave him a nickname, the weeping philosopher, the man who cried because everything was in the process of passing away. The parallel with the Buddha's teaching of impermanence is striking. Two thinkers, separated by thousands of miles, working in entirely different intellectual traditions, arrived at the same fundamental observation. The world is not made of things. It is made of processes. Nothing stays, nothing holds. The appearance of stability is an illusion produced by the slowness of certain changes relative to the speed of perception. Heraclitus expressed this in the compressed aphoristic style that was his signature. The Buddha expressed it through sustained philosophical argument and practical instruction. But the insight is recognizably the same. And yet the differences matter as much as the similarities. Heraclitus made his observation about flux and stopped there. He did not develop a practical method for responding to it. He did not propose a path. He did not claim that the suffering caused by impermanence could be ended. He diagnosed the condition and then, in the fragments that survive, turned to other questions. The nature of the underlying cosmic order, the unity of opposites, the relationship between fire and the cosmos. His insight into impermanence remained a theoretical observation, brilliant but isolated, without the systematic elaboration that the Buddha would bring to the same territory. This pattern repeats across the history of Western philosophy. Western thinkers keep arriving at insights that the Buddha articulated 25 centuries ago, and keep failing to take them where the Buddha took them. The resemblance is close enough to be instructive, but the gap between insight and practice remains. Consider David Hume. In the 18th century, writing in the cool, empirical prose that was his hallmark, Hume launched an investigation into the nature of personal identity that arrived at conclusions the Buddha would have recognized immediately. When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, Hume wrote, I always stumble on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. What Hume found, or rather what he failed to find, was a self. He looked for the thing behind the perceptions, the permanent observer who watches the parade of experiences go by, and it was not there. All he found was the parade itself, a bundle of perceptions succeeding each other with inconceivable rapidity in a perpetual flux and movement. This is non-self, stated in the language of British empiricism. Hume's bundle theory of personal identity is so close to the Buddha's analysis of the five aggregates that scholars have debated whether Hume could have encountered Buddhist ideas through the Catholic missionaries who had been working in Asia since the 16th century. The evidence is inconclusive. It is entirely possible that Hume arrived at his conclusion independently, through the same method the Buddha recommended: careful, honest introspection, the willingness to look at experience without preconceptions and report what is actually found rather than what is expected. But Hume, having arrived at this devastating conclusion, did not know what to do with it. He found the dissolution of the self so disturbing that he famously retreated from it. He played backgammon. He dined with friends. He allowed the natural operations of the mind to reassert the comfortable illusion of selfhood. The philosophical conclusion was correct, he believed, but it was unlivable. The Buddha would have disagreed. The dissolution of the self is not a problem to be escaped from. It is a liberation to be realized, but realizing it requires more than philosophical argument. It requires practice, training, the sustained application of mindfulness and concentration that Hume never undertook and never considered. The comparison with Arthur Schopenhauer is perhaps even more illuminating. Schopenhauer, writing in the early 19th century, placed suffering at the center of his philosophical system in a way that no other major Western philosopher had done before. The world, Schopenhauer argued, is driven by a blind, purposeless force that he called the will. The will expresses itself in every living being as desire, as striving, as the restless pursuit of satisfaction that can never be finally achieved. Every satisfaction is temporary. Every desire fulfilled generates a new desire, and the intervals between desires are filled not with contentment, but with boredom, which is itself a form of suffering. Schopenhauer's diagnosis of the human condition is so close to the Buddha's that he himself acknowledged the parallel. He was one of the first Western philosophers to engage seriously with Indian thought, and he kept a statue of the Buddha on his desk. But Schopenhauer's response to the problem was different from the Buddha's. Schopenhauer saw three possible escapes from the tyranny of the will: aesthetic contemplation, which provides temporary relief by absorbing the mind in the contemplation of beauty; moral compassion, which transcends the illusion of separateness by recognizing the suffering of others as one's own; and ascetic renunciation, the complete denial of the will to live. The last of these, which Schopenhauer regarded as the highest response to the human condition, bears a superficial resemblance to the Buddha's path. But the resemblance is misleading. The Buddha did not teach the denial of the will to live. He taught the understanding of craving. These are not the same thing. Denial is itself an act of will, a form of aversion, and aversion is one of the three roots of suffering. The Buddha's path does not end in denial. It ends in clear seeing, in the direct perception of how craving works, and in the natural cessation of craving that follows from that perception. The existentialists of the 20th century arrived at a different version of the same territory. Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Martin Heidegger. Each in their own way confronted the absence of inherent meaning in human existence and tried to find a response to it. Heidegger described the human being as thrown into a world it did not choose, existing toward a death it cannot avoid. Sartre argued that existence precedes essence, that there is no human nature, no fixed self, that each person is condemned to create themselves through their choices. Camus confronted the absurd, the gap between the human desire for meaning and the universe's refusal to provide it, and proposed that the appropriate response is not suicide or faith, but revolt, the defiant continuation of living in full awareness of the absurdity. These thinkers share with the Buddha a willingness to confront the human condition without the consolation of supernatural hope. They agree that there is no cosmic plan, no divine purpose, no guaranteed happy ending. They agree that the self is not a given, but a project, something constructed rather than discovered. And they agree that the confrontation with impermanence, with death, with the absence of fixed meaning, is not something to be avoided, but something to be faced with as much honesty as one can muster. But the existentialists, like Hume and Schopenhauer before them, stopped at the diagnosis. Sartre offered no practice, no method for transforming consciousness. Camus offered a stance, the absurd hero who pushes the boulder with full awareness, but not a path. Heidegger pointed toward authenticity, the resolute confrontation with one's own death, but he provided no instructions for how to achieve it, no training, no progressive discipline that a person could follow from confusion to clarity. The existentialists were physicians who could describe the disease with extraordinary precision, but who had no treatment to offer. This is the point where the Buddha diverges most sharply from the Western philosophical tradition. Western philosophy, for the most part, treats understanding as its own reward. If you can articulate the problem clearly, if you can analyze it rigorously, if you can argue about it persuasively, then philosophy has done its job. The question of what to do about the problem is often treated as a separate matter, a question for psychology or therapy or religion or personal decision, but not for philosophy proper. The Buddha rejected this separation entirely. Understanding without practice is incomplete. Analysis without transformation is a kind of sophisticated suffering. You can understand the Four Noble Truths intellectually, agree with every proposition, admire the elegance of the analysis, and still be trapped in the cycle of craving and suffering, because intellectual understanding does not by itself change the mind. It changes what you think about the mind. That is not the same thing. The Buddha's path is a form of what the philosopher Pierre Hadot called philosophy as a way of life, as opposed to philosophy as a theoretical discourse. In the ancient world, this understanding of philosophy was not unusual. The Stoics practiced daily exercises in self-examination and emotional regulation. The Epicureans trained themselves to distinguish necessary desires from unnecessary ones. The skeptics practiced the suspension of judgment as a method for achieving tranquility. Philosophy was not just something you studied, it was something you practiced, a discipline of daily life aimed at the transformation of the practitioner. The Buddha fits this pattern but exceeds it. His system is more comprehensive, more psychologically detailed, and more practically specific than anything the Greeks developed. The Eightfold Path is not a set of general guidelines. It is a detailed training program that addresses every dimension of human experience: how you see, how you think, how you speak, how you act, how you earn your living, how you direct your energy, how you pay attention, and how you concentrate your mind. No Greek philosophical school produced anything this systematic. The closest comparison is perhaps Stoic practice, which shares the Buddha's emphasis on the regulation of desire and the acceptance of impermanence, but which lacks the Buddha's radical analysis of the self and his detailed instructions for meditative investigation. There is also the question of scope. Western philosophy, with notable exceptions, has been primarily concerned with the external world, the nature of reality, the structure of knowledge, the principles of ethics, the organization of society. The Buddha's philosophy is primarily concerned with the internal world, the nature of consciousness, the structure of experience, the mechanics of suffering. This does not mean that the Buddha had nothing to say about the external world. The earliest canon contains extensive discussions of cosmology, of politics, of social relationships, of the duties of rulers and citizens. But these discussions are always subordinate to the central project, the understanding and cessation of suffering. The Buddha was not trying to build a comprehensive metaphysical system. He was trying to solve a problem. And the problem was located not in the world, but in the mind that experiences the world. This difference in orientation produces a difference in method. Western philosophy privileges argument. You persuade someone by giving them reasons, by constructing logical chains that lead from premises to conclusions. The Buddha used argument extensively. He was a formidable debater, and the earliest canon records numerous occasions on which he out-argued priests, ascetics, and rival teachers. But he did not regard argument as sufficient. You can win every argument and still be trapped in the cycle of suffering. You can refute every objection and still suffer. Argument addresses the intellect. The Buddha wanted to address the whole mind, including the pre-intellectual, pre-verbal layers of experience, where craving and ignorance operate most powerfully. And the tools for addressing those layers are not arguments, they are practices. Mindfulness, concentration, ethical conduct. These work on the mind at a level that argument cannot reach. The question that the Buddha's philosophy poses to the Western tradition is this: what is understanding for? If understanding does not change anything, if it does not reduce suffering, if it does not transform the quality of the thinker's experience, then what is its value? This is not an anti-intellectual question. The Buddha was one of the most rigorous intellects in the history of human thought. But he insisted that rigor in the service of transformation is different from rigor in the service of rigor. Philosophy that does not heal the soul, he said, is like medicine that does not cure the body. The prescription was always the point. The analysis was in service of the cure. Whether the cure works is a question that philosophy alone cannot answer. It is a question that requires practice, testing, the willingness to follow the path and see where it leads. The Buddha did not ask anyone to take his word for it. He asked them to try. And 25 centuries later, millions of people across the world are still trying, still testing, still following a path laid out by a man who sat under a tree and claimed to have seen something that changes everything. The Buddha taught for 45 years. From the first sermon in the deer park to the last words he spoke under a grove of trees far to the north, he walked the dusty roads of the Gangetic Plain, teaching anyone who would listen. He taught kings and farmers, priests and outcasts, merchants and monks, men and women. He established a monastic order that would become one of the oldest continuously operating institutions in human history. He debated with rivals, resolved disputes among his followers, and returned again and again to the same fundamental themes: suffering, its cause, its cessation, and the path. The order he founded was organized along remarkably democratic lines, at least by the standards of its time. Decisions were made by consensus. Disputes were settled through formal procedures of investigation and judgment. Women were admitted to the monastic order over the initial resistance of some of the Buddha's closest disciples, and although the nuns' order was given additional rules that reflected the social hierarchies of the period, its establishment was itself an act of considerable radicalism. The community admitted members without regard to caste, which placed it in direct opposition to the priestly system that organized Indian society into rigid hereditary strata. A former slave and a former king, if both ordained, were equals within the community. The only hierarchy that mattered was seniority in the order, not birth, not wealth, not social status. The community was not without its difficulties. The early texts record internal conflicts, personal rivalries, and at least one attempt to split the order by a dissident monk, said by the tradition to have been the Buddha's cousin, who sought to impose stricter ascetic rules and to claim leadership for himself. The Buddha handled these crises with a combination of firmness and restraint. He was not a charismatic authoritarian. He was a teacher who led by the clarity of his understanding and the consistency of his conduct, and who trusted the system he had established to resolve its own problems. He aged. The texts are honest about this. They describe a man whose body grew increasingly frail as the decades passed. He suffered from back pain. He fell ill on several occasions. In the last year of his life, at around the age of 80, he contracted a severe illness after eating a meal that included a dish prepared by a blacksmith. The exact nature of the dish has been debated for centuries. It has been interpreted as either a pork dish or a type of truffle or mushroom favoured by pigs. Whatever it was, it made the Buddha severely ill. He continued walking. He continued teaching. He did not stop. The account of the Buddha's last days is preserved in the Great Discourse on the Final Passing, one of the longest and most detailed texts in the earliest canon, and one of the most moving documents in the history of religious and philosophical literature. It describes the Buddha's final journey, undertaken knowing that he was dying. At one point he stopped by the side of the road, exhausted, and asked his devoted attendant to fold a robe so that he could lie down. He lay on his right side, in the posture that would become the standard representation of the reclining Buddha in art across Asia, and rested. He continued to teach during these final days. He reassured his followers. He addressed their fears. When the attendant wept at the prospect of losing his teacher, the Buddha told him not to grieve. All conditioned things are impermanent, he said. How could it be that what has been born, what has come into being, what is conditioned, should not pass away? This was not a platitude offered for comfort. It was the teaching itself, applied to its own author. The Buddha was impermanent. The body of the Buddha would decay and dissolve, just as every other body decays and dissolves. The teaching was not exempt from its own principles. It was confirmed by them. Near the end, the Buddha asked his assembled monks 3 times whether any of them had any remaining doubt or question about the teaching. None spoke. The silence was not, the text suggests, the silence of indifference. It was the silence of people who understood. The Buddha noted this with characteristic precision. He said he was satisfied. Then he spoke his last words. He said, in translation, "All conditioned things are of a nature to decay. Strive on with diligence." Then he entered the meditative absorptions, ascending through each of the 4 and then through the 4 formless attainments, reaching the cessation of perception and feeling, and then descending back through each state in reverse order, arriving at the 4th absorption. And from the 4th absorption, says the text, the Blessed One passed away. The tradition calls this event the final liberation, the complete and irreversible cessation of the aggregates that constituted the being known as the Buddha. It is not death in the ordinary sense, because for a being who has attained liberation, death is not followed by rebirth. The chain of dependent origination has been broken. The fuel that drives the cycle has been exhausted. There is no more becoming. The flame has gone out. The body was cremated, and the relics were distributed among 8 claimant groups who enshrined them in monuments called stupas. These stupas became sites of veneration and pilgrimage, and the tradition of relic worship would become one of the most widespread practices in the Buddhist world. The Buddha had not asked for worship. He had asked for practice. But human beings respond to loss in predictable ways, and the response to the loss of the Buddha included the creation of a vast apparatus of devotion that the man himself might not have recognized. What followed his death was an extraordinary process of transmission, interpretation, and proliferation. Within a few months of the Buddha's death, according to tradition, 500 senior monks gathered for the first council, where they recited the teachings from memory and established the canonical collection of the Buddha's discourses. The attendant, who had been the Buddha's constant companion and who had a prodigious memory, is credited with reciting the discourses. Another senior monk, known for his expertise in monastic discipline, recited the rules of the order. These recitations, passed down orally for several centuries before being committed to writing, became the earliest and most complete collection of the Buddha's teachings that survives. The transmission was not smooth. Within a century of the Buddha's death, disagreements about doctrine and discipline had produced the first major schism. Over the following centuries, the community fragmented into numerous schools, each preserving its own version of the teachings, each developing its own philosophical elaborations. The great division between the traditional and reformist wings, which would shape the entire subsequent history of Buddhism, had its roots in these early disagreements, though the full differentiation of the two traditions took several centuries to develop. The spread of Buddhism beyond India is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of ideas. A later Indian emperor, who ruled much of the subcontinent in the 3rd century BCE and who converted to Buddhism after a particularly bloody military campaign, sent missionaries across Asia. Buddhism reached Sri Lanka, where it established a foothold that persists to this day. It reached Southeast Asia, China, Korea, and Japan. It crossed the Himalayas into Tibet, where it merged with local traditions to produce the distinctive Tibetan form. In each new cultural context, Buddhism adapted, absorbing local customs and philosophical traditions, generating new schools of thought, new practices, new forms of art and literature. The Zen tradition of Japan, the Pure Land tradition of China, the Tibetan Buddhist tradition with its elaborate visualization practices, and its lineages of reincarnated teachers. These are all descendants of the teaching delivered in the Deer Park, but they are descendants that have travelled so far from the original that the family resemblance is sometimes hard to see. And yet the core remains. Beneath the diversity of Buddhist traditions, beneath the cultural accretions and philosophical elaborations and devotional practices that have accumulated over 25 centuries, the Four Noble Truths persist. Life is suffering. Suffering arises from craving. Craving can cease. And there is a path to its cessation. Every Buddhist tradition, in one form or another, acknowledges these truths. Every Buddhist tradition, in one form or another, teaches some version of the path. The details differ, sometimes dramatically, but the diagnosis, the original observation made by a man sitting under a tree in northern India, remains the foundation. The relevance of this diagnosis to the modern world is not something that needs to be argued. It is self-evident. Consider the texture of contemporary life, the constant stimulation, the endless stream of information, the acceleration of desire through technologies designed to exploit the very mechanisms of craving that the Buddha identified. Social media is craving made visible, the restless reaching of the mind for one more update, one more validation, one more fragment of novelty that will satisfy for a moment and then dissolve into the need for another. The consumer economy is built on the assumption that happiness comes from getting what you want, an assumption the Buddha rejected 25 centuries ago. The epidemic of anxiety, depression, and burnout that characterizes modern life in the developed world is, from a Buddhist perspective, not a malfunction. It is the system working exactly as the Buddha said it would. Craving produces suffering. More craving produces more suffering. And a culture that systematically encourages craving will systematically produce suffering. This does not mean that the Buddha had all the answers, or that his teaching is without problems, or that converting to Buddhism is the solution to the modern predicament. The Buddhism that exists in the world today is not the teaching of the historical Buddha. It is a vast, diverse, and internally contested tradition that includes elements the Buddha would not have recognized and might not have endorsed. The teaching of rebirth, for example, which is central to traditional Buddhism, is not something that can be verified empirically, and many modern practitioners either bracket it or reject it outright. The institutional structures of Buddhism, like the institutional structures of every major tradition, have sometimes been vehicles for corruption, authoritarianism, and abuse. The record is mixed, as the record of every human institution is mixed. But the core insight endures, the claim that suffering has a structure, that the structure can be understood, that understanding is not passive but transformative, that the mind can be trained to see its own processes with a clarity that liberates rather than imprisons. These are not articles of faith. They are propositions that can be tested, and the testing does not require believing anything in advance. It requires only the willingness to look. The Buddha's last words were an instruction, not a promise. Strive on with diligence. He did not say, "I will save you." He did not say, "Believe in me and you will be free." He said, "The work is yours. The understanding is yours. The liberation is yours." He pointed the way. He described the path in extraordinary detail. He walked it himself and reported what he found. But he could not walk it for anyone else. No one can. The question the Buddha leaves is deceptively simple. What would it mean to stop wanting things to be other than they are? Not to stop caring, not to stop acting, not to stop loving or grieving or working or creating, but to stop the specific, relentless, exhausting movement of the mind that insists that this moment, this life, this world should be something other than what it is. What would remain if that movement stopped? The Buddha called it liberation. He said it was the end of suffering. He said it was possible. He said it was available to anyone who was willing to look clearly at their own mind and follow the path to its conclusion. 25 centuries later, the hardwood trees still grow in the forests of northern India. The deer park still exists in northern India. The tree of awakening, or a descendant of it, still stands. And the teaching passed from mind to mind across 100 generations still asks the same question it has always asked. Are you willing to look? Thank